Right, it's everybody's favourite part, isn't it? Sewing in the ends. So when you've finished part one, you'll have two pieces. Don't forget you've got to work two pieces of everything because you're going to be joining your blanket in the middle. Try and keep up with sewing the ends in sort of as you go, or as you get to the end. You can do it at the end of each row if you like, or each colour change, however you want to do it. Try and be disciplined and do it as you go. And I'm saying that with a smile in my voice because I never do that, ever, never. So don't be like me. Do the job properly. So we're going to just start here, and I'm going to just show you how to sew some ends in. In the next part, we're going to crochet over some of them, so there's less to deal with. But it is important that you know how to deal with them. So we've got a variation of stitches, as you know, in our part one, and I'm just going to show you how to sew in behind various stitches. Now, how do I know I'm sewing into the back here? Because at the moment, the back and the front look identical. It doesn't, it does change as we work through the project. It'll become very obvious. But at this point, it isn't obvious which is the back and the front. So I'm just going to show you the little end that we started with. This is when we made our initial chain. We have this duck egg end left. So when it's sitting to the left, like so, I know that I'm looking at the right side here. I'm looking at the right side of the project if that first end is sitting to the left. Now, obviously, I don't really want to sew my ends in onto the right side of the work because I'll do my best to hide them, but they're still going to be, you know, a little bit visible. So I do not want to be sewing ends in on this side of the work. So I will turn the work, and all the ends that I will need to sew in for this part will be over on the left hand side. Okay, as I said, it becomes a bit more obvious as you work which is the right and which is the wrong side. So we just sort of got a one-off here. Right, I've got a darning needle here which is big enough for with an eye that's big enough to easily get the yarn through. And if you look, I don't know if you can tell here, you just tell there's a slight bend in the tip of that, and that is intentional. It's meant to look like that. So I find these really useful, but I think these are from Clover. But you don't have to have a needle with a bent tip at all. But if you see them, they are quite useful. So I've thread up the duck egg, and we're going to start by sewing into the backs of double crochet stitches, which is, you know, what we started with. I've just tilted the work just because that's the sort of natural direction that my hand goes when I'm sewing. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and go into each of those stitches just for a few and work across, and I'm trying to do my best to not show too much on the right side. So I'm sort of going through the upright of the double crochet, and I'm going to go across each one. I think I've just missed that, but you know, you get the idea. All the way across for a few stitches. That didn't make sense at all, did it? Like 4 or 5 stitches, not all the way across. And if you look at from the right side, you can see that it's not that visible, is it, the darning needle, which means when I pull through, that yarn isn't going to be too visible at all. So what have I gone through here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stitches, and I'm going to pull my yarn through, and I'm not going to yank it really tight so that it pulls the end in. It's just going to come through and sort of sit snugly against the work. And before I carry on, I'm going to come back on myself. So I'm going to come back round that stitch that I just went behind. So it creates a loop. So rather than continuing on in that direction, I'm coming back on myself. Do you see what I mean? So I'll come back behind that stitch. I think perhaps my needle's a little on the large side for this, but not to worry, we're nearly there. Come back through and come back through a couple more of the stitches to secure and make almost like a little knot, and that is plenty. And when you look at from the right side, you can very barely see that at all, can you? Okay, I'm going to snip that because that's all it needs, and yet I still make a fuss about doing it. It's ridiculous, isn't it, really? So I'm going to snip that close to the work, and we'll look at sewing in trebles. Now trebles, you can see they're a lot more open. So what we want to do is we want to, rather than try and sew in on this area, which is quite open, we need to bring our yarn up to this area here, which you can see sort of the densest part again of the stitch. So if I thread up my darning needle, sorry, I'm going to take, first and foremost, I'm going to take my needle up and come out at the densest part of the fabric. So I'm just sort of coming up and through the starting chain. Okay, and again, just being gentle, don't need to pull it really, really tight. But now you can see that my yarn is sort of sitting nicely in line with the dense part. And I'm going to do the same thing as we did before with the double crochet. And that is just pass the needle behind a few stitches, sort of 4 or 5. Okay, again, looking from the front, not too visible. Very much hope I didn't go off the screen there. Okay, and then come back on itself. So I'm not carrying on up here, I'm coming back down to create a little loop. If you can see, there's the loop. And then I will put my needle back under and carry on for a few more stitches. Pulling that not taut, just nice and flat. And again, right off the top there, and again, not visible from the side, from the front side. So let me cut that one. Okay, and that's really all there is to sewing in yarns. Aim for the densest part of the stitch. If your yarn isn't in line with the densest part of the stitch, pass the needle through to get it to the densest part of the stitch. Pass it behind a couple. I'm going to just do another one with this, just in case I went off the screen. I'm sort of not sure what's filming really. How professional. Right. So this one is attached to the in line with sort of the densest part of the fabric. So I don't need to kind of start anywhere. So I'm going to start exactly where I am, pass behind a few of the stitches, and then come back on myself again, pass behind the same stitch and go along 2 or 3 more. Okay, pull through, snip, turn over, and I think you'll agree that's fine, that's not visible, neatly and securely sewn in at the back. So I'm just going to finish the greens, I promise, and then when you're ready we can move on to part 2.